Hey, welcome back to Coding Nuts and Bolts. Today we're going to discuss two nuts and bolts that you're going to see in every single program that exists. Those are statements and variables. Let's go. Hey, if you're here, you're coding with Paris. I'm Paris, software engineer. Welcome back to Coding Nuts and Bolts. This is the tutorial where I teach you how to code quickly by teaching you the top 20% of concepts. They're going to teach you 80% of what you need to know to start coding. Today's lesson, we dive into our first real nuts and bolts, statements and variables. We're going to take a deep dive and learn what they are and how to use them to your advantage.
Okay, let's talk about two elements you will probably see in every program today, and that's statements and variables. Statements are essentially a line in the code. They are an instruction that the computer is to run. Another way I like to think of statements as a complete instruction that you give your computer. So one example of that would be in our first program, we have one statement, one instruction that we're giving the computer, and that is console.log hello world. So I'll break this down for you. Console is essentially a name of something. We'll just call it the computer. Log is basically a particular action we want this computer to perform. Log, in this case, is telling the computer to repeat something back to you. And then we have the open paren and closing paren here, and some text inside and some quotes. That piece is basically input. Log gives the opportunity for us to tell it what to say. So finally, we have the semicolon, which is a way to end the line. All of this together is saying, hey, computer, repeat the phrase hello world back to me. A single complete statement. Sometimes we like to refer to that as the print statement in programming. And every single language has a way to write a print statement. Remember syntax and semantics and how we used the language example to explain the difference in the previous tutorial? Let's talk about syntax and semantics here. The semantics here is we are telling our computer to shout the phrase hello world. Syntax here would be exactly how we're writing this statement, using console to represent the PC and log being the command that we're giving this computer. This changes per computer language or per print statement, depending on your language. So that would be the syntax. I'd like to give you some examples of how other languages might print the phrase hello world, just to bring this whole syntax and semantics thing home here. Let's come over to our code editor here. Hopefully it's open to your Coding with Paris tutorial folder. And what I want you to do is click the Coding with Paris window here and click add a folder, and we'll call it lesson 2. Okay. Before I move on, I'd like to encourage you in this tutorial and every tutorial to make sure that you follow along. If you're in the car and watching this tutorial to learn, when you get home, go back, rewind it, and type things out. I'm a big proponent of that because it's when you actually start typing things out and struggling with it that things start to stick. And that's how it works with programming. You can learn by watching, but definitely take out your keyboard, start making the keystrokes, and that's when your brain starts to make those connections. So anyway, we have our lesson 2 folder, and we're going to create a new file. Again, you do that by clicking this little file icon, and we're going to type the word statements.js. Make sure you put JS in there. All right, here we go. So now we have our file ready to start learning about statements. As I type, follow along, and we'll go through the different examples of how different languages might do the print statement. So the first one is JavaScript example, which is basically console.log and hello world, right? That was our first example. That was what we had in our first program. Another popular language is Java, and the way they print things is system.out.print line hello world. Okay. All right. It's really just system.out, but my code editor is trying to be helpful here because it knows I'm writing in JavaScript. I write the word system, it just freaks out. It's like, hey, you mean this, but in reality in Java, this is the actual statement you would use to write a print statement. System.out.println. This will print out our statement, hello world. So I'm going to go ahead and just comment that out just in case if my computer wants to continue to freak out about it. Let's go to another popular language, C#. That is usually written console.writeLine. And I believe it's capital right line. Hello world, right? So, hey man, if you had a C# environment, you could run this and it would print hello world. For now. So those two little lines I'm putting in front of each line here is a comment, and that turns it green here in this editor. That's how we can visibly tell the difference here. And then what that does is that makes it so that line of code is there, but the computer doesn't do anything about it. That's actually called a comment. We'll talk about those in a second, but let's continue with our statements example. We have another popular language, which is Swift. When the way you do that is you just write print line. Finally, we have one more popular language that you might hear about, which is Python. Okay, and that one is written print hello world. And actually, going back to Swift and Python, they actually don't use semicolons at the end of their lines. That will be a difference between Python, Swift, and other programs. But as you can see here, if you're looking at all of these various languages, including JavaScript, it's very similar. Each one of these statements they have the same semantics, right? They're telling the computer to do the same thing, but they are written slightly differently. So they are using different syntax. So I hope I put the nail in the coffin for syntax to semantics and talking about the way that these computers might be writing this statement here. So let's move on. Why don't we? I'm going to add a few lines in here. So what is this green text that I'm writing here? This is what most languages refer to as a comment. And a good way to think about a comment is a line of code that is not ran. Essentially, statements are non-executable lines of code, and they are used to usually provide notes and explanations to a lot of things. Hence, what we're doing in this tutorial. They're also used to help you try to figure out what's wrong with your code. And we'll get to that a little bit later when we talk about debugging and those sorts of things. But one thing to note about comments is that every single language has them, and you'll be seeing them a lot in my style of teaching here. One more thing about statements here is that every single language has a way to tell when you're at the end of a complete statement. You've given a complete instruction, and in our language of choice, it's semicolons, which is this character. But every single language has a way. Most of them use semicolon. Others, ones such as Python, for example, Python doesn't have an end of line. If we go back to our example above here in Python just, when the line ends, it notes it's over. Same go for Swift. But you'll see that C# and Java and JavaScript all end with semicolons. These languages know when they see the semicolon that we're at the end of a line. Let's look at the following statement though. Console.log. So if we take a look at this statement, you might have noticed something. If we save this statement and then open our terminal and make sure we're in the right directory, so we're going to print working directory and coding with pairs. Let's go into lesson 2 folder. Okay, and we type the words node and statement. Hit tab and then new, because this is the only thing in this folder that starts with STAT. It filled it out for me. Another cool thing about code editors and terminals and that sort of stuff, Does that make it quicker? Anyway, press enter, run this, and guess what? Repeat it back to you. It's this misspelled string. The point is, this is a statement as well, but notice that it's covering 2 lines. So remember what I told you earlier, that statements are a line of code. Well, that was kind of a shortcut way of thinking about it. A statement is a complete instruction. Basically, it's when you're done telling the computer what you wanted to do, a complete instruction. In this case, is it starts with console.log, ends with a semicolon. And that's, whether it's 3 lines, 4 lines, 5 lines, it's actually a complete instruction. All right, if you're still coding with me here, we'll go ahead and comment these 2 lines out using the double slash here. And JavaScript does have another way of making comments when you want to do things on multiple lines. Here, let's show you that quick. It's basically / and then star, and then when you're done with whenever you're done with your comment, you just use a / star, and then anything after is not included in that comment. So that way, if you had 10 lines here, you don't have to put double slashes in front of all of them. So just a little shortcut for you if you want to do multiple lines. So basically anything in here is comment. Okay. So if you just type that, good job, staying committed, but you don't have to keep that. Okay. So let's talk about one last thing with statements here. And that is, statements are executed from the top to the bottom. Okay. And what I mean by that here is, let's say we wanted to tell the computer to do the following. And a little shortcut here for you to learn as you're using your code editor here. You can actually copy a whole line using Option Shift down if you're on a Mac. There are some keystrokes in the Windows keyboard or Windows that I'm not sure of, but you can copy an entire line without typing the whole thing. So I can say, thank you for rain, thank you for joy, and thank you for pain. Yeah, you know where I'm going? So then we can do so if I were to take this course here, or take these music lyrics and actually try to write these, Command S, Control S, and then tell the console to run our last statement by pressing the up arrow and hitting enter, you'll see that this is the computer singing this to me. Notice that it's running from top to bottom. Okay, that's the way statements will run whenever you run your program. There are some other things we need to consider, which we'll talk about in the future, which is logic flow and the way that works. But any program that you run will start at the top and it will run down to the bottom until every single instruction is performed. Hence, our computer singing one of the most popular songs in the world right now. Anyway, all right, so that's statements. Bonus points for you if you can get your computer to sing a piece of your favorite song using what we've just learned. Let's move on to variables.
Hey, wait a second. Before we dive into the next part of this tutorial, if you like the content that I'm putting out, go ahead and like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone else who wants to know how to program. Don't forget to hit that bell notification either. Okay, let's get back to the content.
So what I'd like you to do is come over, make sure you click your lesson 2 folder, because this is where we're going to create another file, and we're going to call that variables.js. Make sure you put the JS at the end. So a little about variables. Variables are a bucket or a pocket where one can keep something that can be pulled out and referenced over and over again in a program. Variables exist in every single computer language, and a common way variables are created in programs is the following. Let salutation equals hello world. Let is a keyword that lets the computer language know, let the computer know that the next thing that's going to be following is a variable. This is the variable name. Okay, so made up name, just some text that I gave it. It's going to be unique. Equal sign is representing a spot where I'm moving from the name of the variable to what we want put in that pocket or that bucket. And that in this case is the phrase hello world. So if we were to have the computer run this console.log salutation, which is the name of our variable here, save. So if we go down to the terminal, type the word cleared it out, and run node variables.js, hit enter. Congratulations, you created your first variable. Notice that the only thing we put in log this time is just salutation instead of this text here, and it knew what was in that pocket and presented that here. That's a good example of how variables are used in programs, okay? So let's give another example to kind of drive this home. Follow along here. Let greeting name equals Paris, semicolon to end the line. Let salutation 2 equals hello, space, semicolon, console.log salutation 2, comma, greeting name. And I hit tab there because my code editor knew which one I wanted. But I'm going to add another comma and then 3 exclamation points. And then finally a semicolon in the line. So we essentially have a three statement piece of code here. If we were to save this and go down to our terminal and press the up key to run the last command that we did, hit enter, you see that it prints back hello Paris. Okay, so now basically what we did here is we have console.log combining this first variable with the second variable in the third printer. So it's printing these things right next to each other with 3 exclamation points here. So some things about a variable is that they usually can't start with a number or a symbol. Also, certain keywords can't be variable names. For example, variables can't start with keywords such as let. And let's try to create it. So let equals 1. Right. You'll notice that my code editor is screaming right now, and that is because the keyword lets the computer language know that we're about to create a variable, except what I'm following that with is another let, which confuses it. It says, hey man, don't you mean to put the actual variable name in here? So I can't go in here and say 1 blah 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 blah, because again, it doesn't like when your variables start with numbers. Actually, in fact, it might say cannot immediately follow numeric. So this is a very geeky way of it saying you can't do this, right? Most computer languages have rules for variables. You have to look those up and learn those as you go, but JavaScript doesn't like that. So usually you make your variables a name of some kind that you can remember, usually one that represents what's going to be in that pocket or that bucket, and that will go a long way for you. Also, it has to be unique, and we'll talk about why in a second here. So just remember, let does not work, okay? So we'll go ahead and comment that out because that will not run, and maybe put a note here, does not work. We'll comment out these 3 lines as well. Let's talk about variables and their types, okay? So you might have noticed in previous examples of variables that we've created that variables were written like this. Where basically what we're putting in that pocket, in that bucket, is something that looks like this, wrapped in start and end quotes. This is what's called a string variable, meaning that what we want to put in that pocket is usually some type of text or phrase or things between quotes. But there are other types of variables that we can have in a computer language, and these are typically referred to as root types. And root types kind of lets the computer know what type of value is going to be in there. A shortcut to the way I think about it is, think about if you're going to carry your laptop. You wouldn't put it in your pants pocket, right? You would actually have to have a backpack or a bag with a laptop sleeve in it. And that's how computer languages use types. They actually have to change the way they store things depending on what you're trying to store. Now, what types of things would you try to store in a variable besides strings here? Well, other things you can try to store are numbers, booleans, and list of values such as arrays. And we'll talk about each one of those. So let's go back to our program here, and let's start looking at the different types of variables one might want to store in a computer program. First one being a number. Let's say this is a string variable for your reference in your notes here, and we're going to talk about setting a number variable. Okay. And this is going to be a whole number. The way we would do that is use the keyword let. Remember, follow along. The more you do this, the more you remember how to do this. We have a JavaScript way of storing a number variable. So now if I were to go console.log number variable, our variable that we just set here, commented this out and save this, run our last command, then you'll see that the number 10 is printed. Hey, it's actually even a different color from what's up here. This is a number variable. All languages have number variables. They do have a special type of storage for whole numbers versus decimals in some languages, but in JavaScript, right, we can do that with just the same syntax as what we had before. Let's do number with decimal. Comment this last statement out. Save. Go to your terminal again. Run your last command. You'll see that 10.1 is printed there. No issue. This is how you would do numbers. We'll comment that out so that's not ran for us in our next statement here, which is going to be setting a Boolean variable. So what is a Boolean variable? Think of a Boolean variable as just a pocket that stores the value true or false. Why anyone would ever want to store a true or false value? It's usually used when you want to ask the computer a question about the state of something. Let me give you a couple examples here. Let Boolean variable true. Let Boolean variable false equals false. These are two Boolean variables, and it's true or false basically are the values for that. So this is the way you write this in JavaScript, and every language has Booleans. So we're going to do console.log Boolean variable false or true, it doesn't matter. And let's go ahead and save what we have here and run our last command in the terminal. You'll see false and true are printed next to each other. Lastly, we're going to talk about our array type variables. So let's comment out that code there and set our array variable. So use let array variable equals what we have here is an array. Think of an array also a list of things, okay? So an array is a variable or a pocket that allows you to put multiple things in there. And usually those things are logically put in there because they make sense together. Sometimes, for example, someone might ask you to store a list of fruits. Well, then you would have in your array, your fruit array, apple, pear. In this case, we have the 3 bears. The cool thing about this pocket is that this can go on nearly an infinite amount of spaces or things in this list here. And they can also be of multiple types as well. So we can say you can create an array of fake phone numbers, right? And in that array, the first value can be 111, 1111, right? And 222, 2222, and 333, 3333. Just remember when you use arrays, you use open brackets and close brackets, and anything in this array here when you're creating this variable is going to have multiple values, but you separate those with commas. And when you're done, you use a close bracket and a semicolon at the end. Let's go ahead and print these out. See what they look like in our console. Variable. You'll see the first one that I printed is Mama Bear, Papa Bear, Baby Bear, Goldilocks. You see it's printing exactly what I have in that array. Also, a list of booleans. True, false, true, false. Go ahead and comment these out. Hit save. Go down to our terminal, run our last command, and you'll see it printed out these things here. Remember with these lists, the thing about these lists is that they do exist in pretty much every single computer language in some form or another. Think of them as a big pocket. Think of arrays as a big pocket. That's a good one. Okay, so there are a couple things I want to disclose to you because you're going to one day open up someone else's JavaScript program and notice a couple of things, especially with the variables. And that is the JavaScript variable keywords that exist are let, var, and const. So these are three different ways you can write variables. So the are three keywords that will let the computer language know that you are creating a variable. Okay. And yes, they all end with semicolons. So the reason why I'm showing this to you is because you'll notice that I glommed onto one version, which is let. I would recommend that you use this 99% of the time. And the reason being is because each one of these keywords, even though they're all setting variables here, let, var, and const, they're actually setting those pockets or creating those pockets in 3 different ways. And we will come back to talking about those when we look at variable scope, but use let a majority of the time. We'll use it a majority of the time in this tutorial, but you will use let a majority of the time. So this is kind of the new school way of doing this. Next popular one you'll see here is var. This is the way that things were always done in the past. Like we said, the folks who created the language decided to come up with a couple of different ways of using variables in JavaScript. And so this way of doing it was kind of kicked to the curb with the folks doing newer JavaScript. And finally, we have const here. I don't even want to tell you exactly what this is doing yet because it might be a little confusing, but let's just say that you want to use this in smaller amount. It is important to use it sometimes, but there are very special occasions. We'll talk about those later. So just wanted to let you know what those were about. So the last thing we're going to talk about here with variables is the fact that sometimes in computer languages, nothing means something. I don't want to sound like Shakespeare, but that's the truth. And so what you'll see sometimes is in the computer language, we have to find a way to represent nothing also. That's a type of variable. Okay, so here's an example. Setting a variable that represents nothing. In JavaScript, you represent nothing as a null, or you set the value to null, meaning you don't really have anything to put in this variable, but you want this variable to exist. And in fact, when we log this variable, you'll see that it logs out null, meaning nothing. Why would you ever use this? Well, sometimes you care about nothing and you want to do something if nothing is available. Maybe in your program, when you see that this variable has nothing in it, then you want to go and put something in it. But if it has something in it, something that's not null, then you're fine. You'll see patterns like that all the time in programs. We'll probably use them in some of ours that we work with together, but just know that sometimes in computer language, nothing means something. And most computer languages use null as a representation of nothing. But I got to tell you a little bit of something about JavaScript that's a little bit different. There's actually two ways to represent null. So JavaScript has two ways of representing null or nothing. Okay. The first way is through a null, and the second way is through something that is called undefined. Okay. So if we were to step back a little bit and talk about the way you usually set a variable is use an equal sign and you put a value in it immediately. But let's say we did this and log it out. Nothing variable 2. All right, so hit save, and then don't forget to come out the statement above. Hit save, and then go down to your terminal. Press up on your keyboard to run your last command, and you'll see that we have undefined printed here. That is basically a way for the program to tell you that you have a variable that has never been set. And that actually is another form of nothing that you can use besides the null. Remember that's printed out this way here. I would say that some folks like to use this undefined variable in the way that we explained earlier, the way you would use the null, meaning that you usually use it to know when you need to do something else. I would say in your language, in your code, you come up with a style. My rule of thumb is usually to use undefined to represent something that has never been set, and that's it. And I use null for anything that might have been set at one point, but now we want nothing in there. And yeah, that's a confusing thing about JavaScript's representation of nothing. But it's equally important to remember that sometimes in programming languages, you do care about if there's nothing or null in a field, and undefined or null in this case. And so whenever you would find those values, you might want to do something about it. So I'm just going to cover one last thing here about variables statements that I think might be important just in case you might have missed it. And that is variables are set using an equal sign. But it's a good thing to remember that variables only are set using only one equal sign. This one equal sign lets the computer know that you're setting a variable. There are cases where you might see more than one equal sign, but that isn't for variables. That's for a concept that we're going to talk about later. Just remember only one equal sign when setting variables. In fact, if you try to set a variable in any other way, it will not know what you're talking about. And again, this is a syntax that all languages seem to follow for setting a variable. Keywords are important, and we talked about not using let as a variable name because we can't, right? It's a way for the computer to know when we are actually creating a variable. You also can't use let console equals blah blah blah. I believe that's a problem as well. Maybe I'm wrong, but let's go ahead and give that a shot. If you look down here, you'll see that setting console does something. We tried doing that and it gave some weird error. And that's another thing about your console, your actual console down here, or your terminal, that might be something to note, is that your terminal will let you know if there's anything wrong with your JavaScript up above. Sometimes it will give you the line here, the line that's causing the issue. And point out exactly where it's at. Sometimes it will not. Sometimes you will have an issue and you will have to dig in line by line, comment things out, rerun things, and try to figure out where the problem might be occurring. But as you can see, we can't do things like this. We can't say let null equals something as well, right? Because again, that is not going to work, right? You can't declare null anything. So if I were to try to run this, it's going to probably scream, right? So anyway, keywords are important, and keywords that are used to in your computer in your given computer language can't be used as variables or anywhere else in your program. You have to use different words, different names for your variables, and that's just something you have to deal with. But also remember that your terminal here is a good place for you to figure out if something is wrong with your code, because you'll learn this. The more code that you write, the more code you write, the more there's going to be wrong with it. And you'll need tools like the console where you print things out, or the terminal's error messages here to kind of track down what your issues are and fix them. So this will become your best friend, especially when we start talking about the concept of debugging. So let's talk about what we've covered in this tutorial. The first thing we covered are statements, and we talked about the fact that statements are essentially a complete command given to your computer. We broke down statements and what makes up a statement in JavaScript. We referred back to syntax and semantics, especially with our print statements, and kind of broke down how every language has a way of printing things to the console using different syntax. So the semantics are the same in syntax, and we looked at popular languages and how they've actually used the print statement to nail that home. We covered how a complete statement is usually ended with a semicolon in most languages, but they can be ended in different ways as well. Swift and Python, they don't have semicolons at the end of their lines. They just use a new line to represent a new statement. We also covered comments and how they are statements themselves, usually found in pretty much every program that we ever see, but comments are unexecutable lines of code, meaning they aren't actually ran by the computer when it's running your code. Instead, what it's doing is denoting something. It's notes, it's comments, explanations for things that folks commonly use in their program. And we talked about how JavaScript has a couple of different ways of doing that. Next, we dove into variables and what they are. And remember, variables are a pocket or a bucket of sorts that keeps a value that you want to store in your program for references over and over again in other places in your program. And every language usually has a format of which you can set variables. We talked about JavaScript examples specifically here. And I will use the let keyword to do that. Then we dove into types of variables that could be stored. We'll call those root types. Good analogy for that is making sure you have the right pocket to fit the right thing that you're carrying, right? So you wouldn't put a laptop or sword in your pocket. You would put a laptop in the back, and you put a sword in the sheath, and you put your phone in your pocket. If we switch back to the computer example, with types, it helps the computer to know what type of pocket to store that in its memory so that it can store it the best way. Variable types that we talked about are numbers, booleans, strings, of course, and arrays. And arrays are logical lists of values kept together. So it's more of a bigger pocket that you can store multiple values. In arrays, we can have multiple different types inside of that array. You can have booleans in array, you can have numbers in arrays, you can have strings in arrays, but that list is a list that you can put nearly as many things as you want to together, but always do it in a way that makes sense. We wrap things up by talking about the 3 most popular ways of setting variables in JavaScript, and talked about the importance of only using one equal sign, and the fact that in most languages sometimes nothing means something, and so there is an additional type of variable you can set, which is usually a null. But of course in JavaScript is a little bit different because there's also another way of representing nothing in the language, which is undefined. You can set things to undefined, you can set things to null, but my rule of thumb is to only use undefined to represent something that's never been set. So don't set anything to undefined ever. Your console or your terminal, when you run your program, will give you a good indication if something went wrong. It usually gives you a line of code or something to look at. Your code editor as well tries to help you by giving you red squigglies and things, but we'll dive more into debugging a little bit later, right? It will become your best friend. So what I'd like you to do is keep these lessons and keep these things as kind of notes for the things that we've covered here, things that you can always come back to and learn from. And we'll use this style throughout our tutorials. You can go back and say, hey, what did we talk about there? You'll have examples. Refer back to these. I have a bonus assignment for you. It's ungraded. Go ahead and use what we've learned to write a program that does both sides of a knock-knock joke.
So there we go. Statements and variables, our first coding nuts and bolts. Now, every time you look at a program, you're going to be able to point those out right away. How do you feel? If you're feeling good, let's go on to the next piece of our coding nuts and bolts, functions and logic flow. Catch you at the next video. Peace.